unless something freakish happen with Ruiz and Joshua, where they're not fighting, and we can just move right into a unification. A unification bout, or something strange like that happen. But other than that, once I get rid of Ortiz, I'm going to go get rid of Fury as well, too.
That is Deontay Wilder, who was very recently in Manchester, received a warm reception from the boxing fans over there in the UK, discussing his upcoming rematch with Luis Ortiz, a potential rematch with Tyson Fury thereafter, and the subsequent unification fight with whoever the champion is at the time, whoever the unified champion is at the time.
Still don't know.
You know, all of that really hinges on Anthony Joshua making his way past Andy Ruiz, and that's not a foregone conclusion. We don't know with an absolute certitude that that's how things are going to be working out. And I think that's more or less what Anthony Joshua had in mind when he was quoted as saying, "Until they are free, don't talk to me about Wilder and Fury." He's quoted as saying, "I've got something to fight for now. The guys I wanted to fight are tying themselves up for a year and a half. They froze me out. Wilder has agreed his next fight with Ortiz, his next fight with Fury." And he went on to say, "All eyes on Ruiz Jr. Nobody can talk to me about Wilder or Fury. That is irrelevant, and nobody should talk to me about Wilder or Fury after I beat Ruiz Jr. because they have made it clear what they are doing. They have got the whole of 2020 booked up. Until they are free, nobody talk to me about Wilder or Fury." And the reality of it all is, as anticlimactic as those statements might seem, there's a lot of truth in them. That where Wilder may be thinking, "Oh, I'm going to fight Ortiz and I'm going to fight Fury, and then afterwards I'll walk into a unification fight." Nothing is promised, ladies and gentlemen, and Anthony Joshua realizes that now more than Wilder does, because here we are, and Anthony Joshua is on the rebound. He's on the comeback trail. He's come to the realization that thinking that far ahead is an exercise in futility, and overall it's redundant, because you don't know what could happen inside of, 2-3 fights? Just about anything in the sport of boxing, most importantly in the heavyweight division, where one punch can completely change everything, including the landscape of the division overall. Anthony Joshua seems focused on the task at hand, rightfully so. Perhaps taking his eyes off the ball, perhaps thinking too far ahead, is what finds him in this situation. And that's because from April 2018, last year, to well after that, into 2019, over a year's time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy was poured into trying to make that undisputed heavyweight title fight, and it didn't come into fruition. It didn't come off. For their best efforts, in spite of their best wishes, they didn't get that fight. So why waste time thinking about that when that is not what's in front of you? What's in front of you is an Andy Ruiz rematch.
That's what's going on.
And let's be honest, both Wilder and Fury have made it clear what they mean to do. They mean to face each other for a second time. I mean, if you're going by what the fighters are saying, if you're going off of what they're telling you that Anthony Joshua isn't in their immediate future. So why question him about them when they have already told you what they plan to do after their upcoming fights? Once again, it's just an exercise in futility. There's no sense in mulling over it at this point in the juncture, and in all honesty, many aspects, many roadblocks that fight
has had.
The fight for the undisputed heavyweight championship.
They're still there.
The same roadblocks that were there before are still there now. Some more significant than others.
The situation hasn't changed much.
How the fighters and the different factions mean to pay those fighters is very important, and it's a stumbling block. It's a potential hindrance. Why?
Why?
Because where Anthony Joshua is getting guaranteed money from DAZN, that's money that's guaranteed. That's not maybe if the pay-per-view sells this much. It's not that kind of money. It's guaranteed cash. Where he's getting guaranteed cash from them, what Wilder's side of things wants to do is entirely different. They mean to pay them in an entirely different way. They'll get a nominal guarantee, and the bulk of what they stand to make will essentially be coming out of the fans' pockets. But therein lies a dilemma. You don't know how many fans are actually going to buy this fight. You don't know that. And that particular roadblock, that particular aspect of it, it was already there, and it's still here today. So even if Wilder beats Ortiz for a second time, and even if he actually beats Tyson Fury in their rematch, he's not gifted a draw, but he actually wins. Even if those things come to pass, and Wilder makes his way past those two guys, guess what? There's still that roadblock to be reconciled. Showtime wants to stage that fight. But Showtime is not guaranteeing Anthony Joshua the kind of money that DAZN is guaranteeing him. Emphasis on guarantee. Keyword, guarantee. Not some maybe pretend money from an upside, but actual money guaranteed. That's an issue. And if Showtime isn't going to guarantee Anthony Joshua the kind of money that DAZN is guaranteeing Anthony Joshua, guess what? He's not crossing that fucking street. Not for empty promises, not for maybe pretend money, generous sales projections. It's not happening. Not in the face of guaranteed cash. I mean, you didn't see Showtime make a counter offer to DAZN's $100 million, right? You didn't see them match or surpass what DAZN was willing to pay Wilder to have that fight. No, that's not what they did. They gave him a slight purse increase. They didn't even match what DAZN was willing to pay Wilder to have that Brazil fight on DAZN. They didn't match it. Stephen Espinoza admitted that himself. You can get mad about it. You can bitch all you want, but it's not going to change the words that came out of the man's own mouth. They didn't even guarantee Wilder what DAZN was willing to guarantee Wilder for that same fucking Brazil fight. That should be telling you something, okay? When DAZN put up that $100 million, when they said they were willing to give Wilder $100 million, 3-fight engagement, $20 million for the Brazil fight, and $80 million for 2 Joshua fights. When they did that, Showtime didn't formulate a counteroffer. All they did was give Wilder a slight purse increase that wasn't equal to or greater than what DAZN was willing to put up, and propose that he have other fights with other fighters on Showtime. Other fights, like this Luis Ortiz rematch we're about to see, if they ever get the goddamn thing done, and their potential Fury rematch. But in all honesty, who knows where that rematch will land? Because now, that's an ESPN/Top Rank, Showtime/PBC situation. Who knows where that rematch with Fury will land, if it lands anywhere? In all honesty, ESPN is a much bigger network than Showtime. It's the biggest sports network in the country, you understand. They got a lot more juice than Showtime does. So, I mean, essentially what we're seeing is that in light of what DAZN was guaranteeing Deontay Wilder to have that fight with Brazil on their platform and to have 2 Anthony Joshua fights, what we saw was that Showtime did not match or surpass that offer. They didn't even match what DAZN was offering Wilder to fight Brazil. So if they can't match what DAZN was offering Wilder to fight Brazil on their platform, what are the odds that Showtime is going to match what DAZN is guaranteeing Anthony Joshua to fight on that platform, to stay on that side of the street? That's what it's a question of, and you know what? That's what it's always been a question of. What can Showtime guarantee Anthony Joshua to decide to have the fight there as opposed to DAZN? That's a stumbling block that has been in play throughout. And this is just what we know, you understand. This is just what we've seen so far. The situation could evolve. The situation could change because essentially we're talking about an environment to where an Ortiz rematch has already taken place. A Fury rematch will have already taken place. A Ruiz rematch for Anthony Joshua will have already taken place. And a potential fight with Kubrat Pulev will have already taken place. What would those fights do to those fighters' marquee values thereafter? What kind of new demands may be put up as a result of those contests, of those outcomes, and what effect those outcomes have on those fighters' profiles? It's a malleable situation that is fluid, ever-changing, and 2 fights from now, it could be an even harder fight to make, essentially. So when you're thinking that far ahead, you're dealing with a lot of variables. You're dealing with a lot of intangibles, fluid situations, things that could change. And in that way, it's a redundancy because you just don't know what's going to happen. There are already hurdles to be addressed, and there could be more in the near future. Those things in mind, thinking about either Tyson Fury or Deontay Wilder, the undisputed heavyweight title fight, thinking about all of that right now is an exercise in futility. Based on the most recent events in regards to trying to make this fight a reality, it's been a tug-of-war between DAZN and Showtime. And where Showtime may not have the means to have things their way, where they may have limitations as a platform, guess what? PBC could decide to get Fox involved. Fox is a much bigger network than Showtime. More means, more money, more juice. Something like that could change things. It could make them harder. It could make it more difficult, you know? An even more strung out tug of war. And this is what could happen in the future, which makes thinking about that fight, making it to that fight, which is another matter entirely. But that makes thinking that far ahead a redundancy, because you've got to make it to that point, and you can't get stuck looking that far ahead, because you might overlook what's right in front of you. And what's right in front of Anthony Joshua right now is Andy motherfucking Ruiz. People didn't think he'd have to be fighting this guy 2 times. A lot of people didn't see that coming, okay? But that's what's going on. And I think it's for this reason that Anthony Joshua is keeping his eyes on the ball this time. He doesn't want to be bothered with those kinds of questions, those kinds of conversations, when he knows, and we should know, that that fight, with either Tyson Fury or Deontay Wilder, that's not next. It's not. And those guys have already told you that. So what are you asking me about those guys for?
And the latest updates on the Joshua versus Ruiz rematch seem to indicate, at least per Mike Kopinger, that Andy Ruiz has agreed in principle to head to Saudi Arabia for the rematch with Anthony Joshua on December 7th after receiving a new financial package. And this more or less denotes one of the scenarios that I presented in my previous video, and I'll leave the link to that video in the description box, that the behavior, the resistance that we have been seeing from Andy Ruiz as of late could indicate 2 to 3 possible scenarios. One being that, he's just being a hardliner so that he could get a little something off the top, a little bit more cash. Because based on the agreement that he walked into previously, he was only actually entitled to $9 million. And that amount was a set amount. And given the size, the scale, and the scope of the rematch, this guy is reneging. He's reneging because he wants more money. Depending on how much more he wants, however,
is what would determine where the story goes from there. That obviously Andy Ruiz wants more money, but the question is how much more, and is it an amount that Matchroom is willing to provide? Because if this guy goes getting crazy, he wants inordinate amounts of money, both sides of it could find themselves in a proverbial stalemate, and that could leave Matchroom so inclined to take Andy Ruiz to court. They don't want to have to do that. What is paramount to them and those Saudi Arabian investors is making sure that the fight comes off, that the fight happens, and that it happens in a timely fashion, that things go smoothly. So with those things in mind, maybe what Andy wants, the accommodations, the considerations that he wants, are not so excessive that they won't be provided to him. That, you want a little something more? We'll give you a little something more, so long as you're not getting crazy. That was one scenario I presented in my previous video, but yet another scenario I presented is that perhaps Al Heyman was trying to find a legal way to get Andy out of this rematch. That this guy, he's contractually bound to give Anthony Joshua a rematch. And if we're seeing this resistance, one way to interpret it is that he's got Al Heyman in his ear telling him to drag his feet, to make things difficult, to ask for more money, to be difficult about the venue so that he can find a way out of it. Any means necessary. Even if he's got to start talking about security risks in Saudi Arabia. That kind of a situation. And it does appear that it was more the former than the latter in terms of the scenarios. That Andy, for all intents and purposes, he does appear to be on board. This subject has sparked a lot of debates here in the YouTube boxing community and the Facebook groups as far as what entitlements does Andy Ruiz have, if any, ahead of the rematch? Does he have a say-so where the rematch takes place? Does he have a say-so as far as what the fighters stand to be paid? And this created a lot of confusion, and I'm sure that there's still some floating around as far as whether Andy Ruiz has a say-so. And the real answer to the question is no, not on paper. All those decisions, the final say in what goes on, really does rest with Matchroom, because Andy Ruiz signed a legally binding document. So if there are any changes, if there are any accommodations being made, it is only because Matchroom has the power to do so. It's up to them. Whether or not they're willing is besides the point, because it is still their decision to make.
Friendo.
This is what I think most people are confused about. This is what I think has been a stumbling block in previous conversations regarding this rematch. That whether or not Matchroom decides to accommodate or not accommodate Andy Ruiz, it's still their decision to make. Whether or not Matchroom decides to stage the fight in the UK or somewhere else, a neutral venue, it is still their decision to make.
It's always been up to them.
There's a situation to where a less evolved mind may mistake the kindness and consideration on the part of Matchroom for weakness. That If they are making accommodations, it's not because they have to, but simply because they want to, as their best interests lie in orchestrating a rematch with minimal friction. That is paramount to Matchroom. Thus, they may be willing to accommodate some of Andy Ruiz's requests, provided that they are not so outlandish, so obscene, that Matchroom
can't accommodate the guy enough. That now, you're just making things so difficult that the rematch itself is actually in jeopardy. I talked about how I felt that if Andy Ruiz just wants a little more, a little something off the top, I actually thought that Eddie Hearn would provide that to that guy, give that guy those considerations, because what Eddie Hearn, what Matchroom, all the aforementioned parties, including the investors, what they want more than anything is to orchestrate the rematch. If they have to pick, of course they'd rather the rematch comes off as opposed to litigation, a court battle. That's the last thing anybody wants. It's something they could resort to if Andy were too big of a prima donna, but better still, if we're talking about choices, they'd rather the rematch comes off smoothly. And with those things in mind, so long as what Andy wants is not something so outlandish that they refuse to give it to him, they may actually accommodate him. That's more or less a scenario that I presented, and that does appear to be the case, because the reports coming out now seem to indicate that Andy's on board to go to Saudi Arabia, but with a new financial package. But if we're gonna mull over the legalese of the shit, whatever financial package Andy Ruiz has been provided, if there have been improvements or subtractions, whatever is going on, whatever's going on is something that Matchroom so decided should go on or could go on. Why? Because they've been empowered by the original agreement, the initial contract. Thus, all the decision making, regardless of what considerations they take into account, all the decisions are still being made by them. It's not that fucking hard to understand if you're not a caveman.
The other thing is, look, it is Saudi Arabia, and I don't think the fact that he's only getting, quote, only 9 to 10 instead of more, because Eddie's making a big score with this. And even his trainers like saying, Steve, none of us want to go to Saudi Arabia.
Well, yeah, no one...
But contractually, that rematch clause was agreed to before the first fight. I've actually read a boilerplate Matchroom Sports agreement where all they do is just change the names. It's absolutely legally, they don't have a leg to stand on. The venue and the other terms and the date are set by Matchroom Boxing.